Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion podcast. I'm JJ Kimchi. Pirkei Avot, often translated as Chapters of the Fathers, is a unique volume within the corpus of the Mishnah. Rather than legal debates, this text records the ethical teachings, tidbits of sage advice, statements of values, and general life guidance that were taught by the rabbis of the Mishnaic period. For its wisdom and moral force, as well as its pithy and memorable aphorisms, this text has become a favorite of Jewish students and teachers the world over, and has made its way both into the Jewish classroom and into the Jewish liturgy. Today we shall be taking a closer look at Pirkei Avot, discussing its form, its content, and the historical and philosophical context with which it interacts. Joining us today to discuss all this is Dr. Yair Furstenberg, Chair of the Department of Talmud at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Professor Furstenberg has written widely on the evolution of rabbinic law and thought in the classical period, and his latest book in English is Purity and Identity in Ancient Judaism from the Temple to the Mishnah, published by Indiana University Press in 2023. It is our pleasure to welcome Professor Furstenberg to the podcast of Jewish Ideas today. Professor, welcome.
Thank you, JJ. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent, excellent. Very exciting. We're going to have a wonderful discussion on Pirkei Avot today. So before anything else, I would like, if you can, to try and describe Pirkei Avot. If someone who knew nothing about it came to you and asked you, what is this thing? How would you describe it? How would you classify it? Would you say it's one homogeneous text, or is it a text of lots of different textual corpuses? And what are the main things it seeks to address? How would you describe Pirkei Avot?
Thank you for the question. I think I'll start by the way I think most people view Avot. If they know anything about it, they would view it, I think, as, I would say, almost a random repository of rabbinic wisdom. We have 5 or 6. It depends how you look at it. If you look at the Mishnah volumes, we have 5 chapters. But if you open it in the prayer books, in the Sidurim, you see that there is a 6th chapter added to it, which is actually not a Mishnah, not an original part, but was added with similar wisdom sayings pertaining specifically to the value of studying Torah. And this chapter was added because this tractate as a whole was viewed as part of the liturgy and was read Shabbat after Shabbat between Pesach and Shavuot. So you have 6 Shabbatot and you would read it. And what happens is that people read it just as an opportunity to find interesting or relevant ideas, some ideas that you can write on posters in the classroom, or politicians can quote in their statements, and stuff like that. And it's like, again, a source for Jewish wisdom. And in that sense, it's similar to reading the book of Mishlei. It's maybe the hardest book to read in the Tanakh. You could even say that it's somewhat boring to read Mishlei because you have all these ideas and they're not structured in any way and they're almost random. Now, actually, although the Mishnah Avot is a wisdom text, and it does draw from this very, very ancient tradition of wisdom text that goes back much before the Tanakh, going back to Egyptian text in the 3rd millennia BCE, right? This is a very ancient tradition of wisdom text, of practical wisdom, of instructions, of ethical and other valuable daily instructions. Avot takes that tradition and reshapes it within distinctively rabbinic format. And this is a crucial issue. So on one level, it's part of a wisdom tradition. On a second level, it's shaped as standard rabbinic Mishnaic text with all of its stylistic, structural features, as I'll say in more detail in a moment. And the third aspect, which in my view is most interesting, it frames it within a clearly historical framework, meaning that these are not ideas that are timeless. Part of the problem of reading these wisdom texts, that they're, on one hand, they're timeless. There's ideas that are, they always work, right? You can quote them and today as you could have quoted them 2,000 years ago, but they're so general in that sense, they miss the power of a statement that reflects its time and age and responds to actual concerns and reflecting the actual people that are saying these stuff. And what happens in Pirkei Avot is that statements are attributed to specific rabbis, and the tractate as a whole is structured within a historical framework that we can trace, right, these wisdom from very early times to the end of or the middle of the Amoraic period at about the 3rd century, and identify changing context, identifying different issues and different challenges that the rabbis are responding to.
Interesting. We're definitely going to get to the historical context in a moment. I mean, do we know why and how it ended up in the Mishnaic corpus? Because, as I said in the introduction, it's very different from every other tractate of the Mishnah that we have. Not to be so blunt, but what's it doing there?
That's a fantastic question. And some scholars actually argue that it does not belong to the Mishnah. They argue there are indications that some of the sayings in the Mishnah are later than Rabbi Judah the Patriarch. So if we assume that Rabbi Judah the Patriarch is the redactor of the Mishnah on the whole, so hey, maybe the Mishnah is a later text and does not belong there and should not be considered because it's so strange. But I think that's a superficial view, because Tractate Avot very much fits the Mishnaic structure and formula and style. How do we see that? What is the Mishnah? If we try, the Mishnah is a revolution. We can speak about the Mishnah. You had other chances to do that with other guests, but the Mishnah is a revolution in comparison to Second Temple literature. It's a crucial thing to point out. Now, what the Mishnah does, it has its for a standard form. What is that? Fragments of statements of specific rabbis, right? String together in, I would call it intermediate units according to topic or some kind of linguistic connection that connects the different discrete statements. And those units, which usually are at about half a chapter or a chapter, are connected into this larger framework of the topic, right? The Mishnah is never a coherent text. The Mishnah is always a compound of different sources strung together, woven together into larger. And you have to analyze the Mishnah again, not only on the discrete level of the specific statement, but on the overarching structure. Now, this is the same thing that we find in Tractate Avot. This unique rabbinic form of teaching is both the way they teach law and the way they teach wisdom more generally. And there's another very important point that we usually are not aware of, is that the Mishnah, what the rabbis did is not only create a new form of instruction, but what it did, it took the variety of literary genres of Second Temple Judaism and narrowed them all into this one rabbinic, familiar, standard form of instruction. We can take a few examples, but theological ideas, are boiled into this specific structure, historical narratives. And wisdom, in our case, we can see how what the rabbis are trying to do is to fit them all into this, their unique mode of instruction, and that is the Mishnah. So in that sense, Pirkei Avot belongs to the Mishnah. And another indication, we'll have more opportunities to show the connection to the Mishnah, but I do want to point out one interesting thing, is that we can prove, particularly in this tractate, we can prove that it belongs, that it was redacted by the house of Rabbi Judah the Patriarch. And this proved beyond any doubt that it belongs to the Mishnah, which is generally attributed to Rabbi Judah the Patriarch, but there's no clear indication. And it's particularly in Masechet Avot, in Tractate Avot, that we have this textual indication. How do we see that? Maybe I'll take the opportunity to describe the structure of the tractate more generally.
Yes.
Yeah. So, as I said, if we open the Siddur, if we open the prayer book, we have 6 chapters. We leave the sixth chapter aside, and we're left with 5 chapters. These 5 chapters can be divided into 3 parts. Chapter 1 and 2, which I would call the historical chapters, which start from Moses and Sinai and end with the rabbis living after the destruction of the temple, the disciples of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And here this is dominated by the notion of the transmission, the tradition from Moshe to the rabbis. Those are the first chapters. The second group of chapters, for a reason that I'll explain soon, does not have a clear chronological framework, although it's clear that there's a difference between chapter 3 and chapter 4. Chapter 3 are the earlier rabbis. Chapter 4 are, in general, the next group of rabbis. These chapters are connected not through a clear chronological framework, but are connected through very characteristic of the Mishnah, linguistic connections, names of the rabbis that are similar. Akavia and Akiva will appear together, right? Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Laza will appear together. And terms, the one Mishnah will relate the term mitzvah, so the following Mishnah will also relate to the term Mishnah. So there was a complex system related to language, terminology, and style that connect those Mishnah together. Again, very characteristic of the Mishnah. When you read any Masechet, any tractate, even on legal issues, many times what connects the discrete halachot together are small linguistic elements that help you memorize it on the whole. The fifth chapter is the chapter of Numbers. On the whole, it's anonymous. I mean, there's no specific rabbi that presents this whole chapter, and it's, roughly speaking, it talks about I would say the historical overview from creation to the end of time and to the world to come, but through numbers that in some way classify the world. I would say in very general terms. Okay, so returning to the point I started before, how do we see the fingerprints of the house of the patriarch? So in the first two chapters, as I said, we start from Moses and Sinai, who transmitted the Torah to the elders, and the elders then transmitted it to the people of the great synagogue, the Knesset HaGdolah, and then to the pairs, right? We have Antigonos Isocho Kibel received from Shimon HaTzadik, and then Yosei ben Yoezer and Yosei ben Yochanan received from them, and then we have the pairs, and then we arrive at the most famous pair towards the end of the first chapter, Hillel and Shammai, those two sages who were active in the Herodian period. At this point, we would expect the next stage of reception appears in the middle of the second chapter, and that is Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. It says in chapter 2, Mishnah 8, it says Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai received from Hillel and Shammai. Okay, but what happens in the middle? So we have Hillel and Shammai in the middle of the first chapter, and then at the middle of the second chapter, we have the next stage of the reception. But in the middle, we have a list of sages who do not belong to this transmission from rabbi to disciple, but
specific chain of transmission.
The chain of transmission do not belong to the chain of transmission, but suddenly we have a list of people that out of the blue, Rabban Gamliel, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, Rebbe, Rabban Gamliel Bno, the son of Rabbi Yehuda Nasir, Rabbi Judah the patriarch, and then we have again a Hillel, which is probably not the original Hillel. What we have here is the family of the patriarch, beginning from the Second Temple, Rabban Gamliel, who was active during the beginning of the first century, and moving on to his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren until we arrive at someone 200 or 250 years later, this Hillel, who is Hillel the patriarch from the beginning of the 4th century. So what happened here in the text? This is a nice case where you see how textual analysis can help us reconstruct the history of the rabbinic movement and the changing ideologies and powers within this movement. Because what we had initially, the basic text, it talks about this transmission. Now, this classical Pharisaic notion, which we'll talk more about later, of a Mesirah, transmitting the Torah from one generation to another. But this transmission brings us only to the end of the 1st century, to Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Now, a new power rises in the 2nd and 3rd century, and that is the house of the patriarch. Now, the house of the patriarch has to link itself into this list of names. And the way it does it, it connects itself. It says, hey, I'm going to take the first one, our patriarch, the head of our family, and connect him directly to Hillel and Shammai, and in a way impose our own family interest, I would say, or political interest into the Mishnah. In the end, this family, if we ended at the third century, what we see here is someone at some stage imposed the family of the patriarch into the Mishnah, proving, in my view, that this Mishnah was redacted by this family. Again, just to show you that we're in the world of the Mishnah, we're in the world of Reb Judah, the patriarch, who has redacted the Mishnah, and this is an opportunity to really highlight the role of this family.
Interesting. So they're saying that the very fact that this chain of transmission, which we'll discuss a bit more in a moment, ends and has its culmination in Pirkei Avot with the family of Yehuda Nasi, that is evidence, that is the fingerprints that we are looking for as to who put this together and why. In other words, one reason, among many others, is that you can have the chain of transmission basically solidifying and justifying the power or the control that the house of the Nasi, the Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and his family had over the rabbinic culture at the time.
I would put it differently, if I may, because what is the role of the chain of this transmission in the first part of Pirkei Avot? I think usually readers of the Mishnah assume that here is an opportunity for the rabbis to justify or to prove their own teachings, right? How do we know that our teachings are the correct teachings? We're actually connected. We have this connection through this chain of transmission. We have this connection to Moshe, and we're continuing on. This is like the ultimate conservative position of we're only continuing what our forefathers had, and we're part of this very long chain. Now, I think the Mishnah is more complex. While it argues that this chain of transmission was applicable and relevant for some of the history of our movement, the rabbis are very well aware of the fact that this chain has been cut. It's ended. Because if we look at the narrative, if we, for a moment, remove this section of the family of the patriarch and read this section as I assume it was created at the end of the first century by Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai and his disciples. What is the story that these two chapters are telling us? On the one hand, they're saying, yes, there's this transmission through this specific, I would call them proto-rabbis or Pharisees during the Second Temple period, but this chain ended with Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. And how do I know that it ended? Because Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, it doesn't say that his disciples received the Torah from Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. This term, which recurs all the time in the first chapter, reflecting this transmission, does not appear in the second chapter of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is the last part of this chain when now he starts a new model. And what is the new model? Multiply your disciples, an idea that appears in the beginning of Avot. I think this was the model of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai when he said, nurture many disciples.
Hamidu talmidim harbe.
Hamidu talmidim harbe. Exactly. Nurture many disciples. Now, we have to understand the idea of nurturing many disciples is counterproductive to the whole notion of tradition, because it actually undermines the notion of tradition. This is something I called in my own work from tradition to dispute. Because the first thing we know when we meet these 5 disciples, and this is the number that we haven't seen yet, we've seen 1 or 2 transmitting to 2 as something that is very limited, something that can be controlled. A Torah, you know exactly who's carrying it, and you know that it will be taken care of and will be precise and nothing will change. And this is like a traditional conservative view. But once you get to Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, he for some reason understands that this system will not work anymore. So he says, my strategy will be the opposite strategy. What I'm going to do is I will nurture many students, and that will enable the Torah to spread, but we're paying a big price. And the big price is disputes. Because what happens with Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai and his students is, what we learn is that he goes and asks them a question, not in law, but in ethics, but suddenly there is a dispute also in that, right? He asks them, what is the straight path that one should choose? And they start disputing. So you can say, what's the matter? You say this, and you say this, and you say this. All these possibilities are okay, right? No. At the end of this discussion, he says, no, I agree with Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, and I think his answer is better than your answer. So what you see is this is the world, this is like a nice demonstration of the world of the rabbis, as something that was transformed from a concept of tradition to a concept of dispute and personal positions and development of thought and Torah through this kind of dynamics. What I would argue that the rabbis at the second century, the Tannaim, are aware of the fact that tradition is part of the old world. We're in the new world now, and we need new tools, and we create it through rabbinic discourse, through dispute, etc.
That's fascinating. In your mind, is it tied to specific historical events, meaning the destruction of the temple, the rise of Yavne? Was that the catalyst for this?
Yeah.
Or is it only sort of tangentially connected, and actually this is due to other dynamics?
The amazing thing is, I'm more a scholar of rabbinic law. Most of my work is trying to understand the dynamics of the creation of rabbinic law and the shift from Second Temple discourse of law to rabbinic discourse of law, to the really revolution, the revolution of the rabbi. I don't believe in revolutions. Let's put it this way. My historical method is much more messy, and I understand things develop in a messier form. And I try to track within early rabbinic literature, within the Mishnah, within the Tosefta, within these early rabbinic texts. I try to trace step by step the transformation of these forms of study and conceptions of Torah. And I think things are much more gradual than we'd like to say. So some scholars would say rabbis came to Yavne. This is like the famous Shaya Cohen theory. The rabbis came to Yavne. They understood that the whole model of Second Temple sectarianism was wrong. And now they're going to create a pluralistic Bet Midrash, house of study. And we're going to all feel that we're connected. And we solve the problem through a different form of work. Now, this is nice. And I think it represents the result of this process. But if we look carefully into halachic text, we see a gradual transition from the role of tradition, of shmu'ah, of highlighting the role of things that you carefully are trying to preserve the earlier legal traditions, to the role, and this is Rabbi Akiva's phenomenal role in the history of halakha, to creating a kind of mechanism for generating new halachot. And taking and many times disguising it as a part of a more traditional reading, but filling it with new ideas. You can see that, and you can see the gradual shift taking place during Yavne. You can say, if you want to say more precisely, between the first and second generation of Yavne. The famous Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua, those are the great sages of the earlier stage in Yavne before Rabbi Akiva. They are strictly into the idea of tradition. And so you would ask Rabbi Eliezer something and he would say, I haven't heard, I'm not going to answer, I don't know the answer. And even Rabbi Yehoshua, who many times is considered to be more liberal, more innovative, is also very careful about the idea of shmu'ah, what we heard, of exactly preserving that. And that shifts. And that is exactly, I think, reflected here. That Pirkei Avot presents this kind of narrative without relating directly to halachic issues, but it presents the same kind of shift in rabbinic study culture. Now, we should be aware, and I think this is something that has to be emphasized, we have to be aware of the centrality of tradition within the specific identity of the Pharisees, who are the predecessors of the rabbis. Within Second Temple Judaism, there are a few ways to cut the Jewish ideologies or the differences between different groups, right? So we have the Sadducees, the Tzdukim, we have the Pharisees, the Prushim, we have the Essenes, the Isseim, and as Josephus describes them in a few places, and also in the New Testament, you find these different groups, etc. And the one major feature of the Pharisees is and that Josephus himself states that they follow the tradition of the elders besides following the Torah. And the Sadducees rejected the traditions of the elders, of the fathers, because they were strictly committed to the Torah itself. Now, we have to understand that these are two forms of religiosity, right? There's a textual-oriented religiosity of the priests, because the Torah is basically a priestly Torah, and there is I would say, a more popular form of religiosity through tradition. And that's the way the Pharisees developed their own views of what is required, and also connected to wider circles within the Jewish society through this notion of tradition. They highlighted this notion, and this is what they fought for. And I think the Chachamim, on the one hand, are trying to maintain, they see themselves as followers of the Pharisees, but on the other hand, they understand that the destruction of the temple, and you asked what is the historical feature, I think mainly the destruction of the temple made them understand that we're in a new world which requires a new form of study. And actually, one could think also of modern equivalents to this kind of shift. What happens to society moving from one continent to another? Can we really speak about tradition when we are creating a new community in a new place? I think that's a lot of what's happening here.
Interesting. Much I'd like to continue discussing this. There's a lot of other fun stuff in Pirkei Avot to cover. One important facet of the Mishnayot, of the text that we have here, is that quite a bit of it seems to be geared towards giving advice to judges, right, to Dayanim. And you have this throughout some of the early chapters, and you've claimed the Mishnah Avot is proposing a sort of a legal philosophy of some kind, or at least gesturing towards one, and that sits on a kind of continuum with other legal philosophies that were around at the time in the ancient world, and that this interacts not only with other possibilities in terms of just other conceptual possibilities, but also with practical ways of convening courts that existed in the ancient world. Could you perhaps talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I mean, I wouldn't claim that there's a legal philosophy here in the Mishnah. It's part of my general argument is that we should read the rabbis as responding to current issues, and that helps us also understand shifts or changes within these kind of instructions. I'll just point out one or two examples taking place in the first chapter. Again, the first chapter follows Second Temple Judaism, or I would say is like a Pharisaic manifest, starting with the earliest proto-Pharisees and on to Hillel and Shammai, late in the Second Temple period. And if we read into, and I recommend that the listeners, when next time they open the Pirkei Avot, try to think, what is the meaning of the fact that one of the rabbis in the beginning of the Hellenistic period, his name is Antigonus? That's a very interesting fact, right? Exactly when Hellenism is spreading, we have a rabbi, a rabbinic figure, or at least, that has a Greek name, and we can think more precisely about what are the issues. Are there specific Hellenistic ideas that they're responding to in these? And again, I won't go into all the examples. Just take an example relating to this issue of law and jurisdiction. Let's start with the end of the first chapter. The end of first chapter, we have a statement of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, the world exists for the sake of three things. Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omed. For the sake of judgment, for the sake of truth, and for the sake of peace. As it says, truth, justice, and peace shall establish you in your gates. Now, it's clear, and here the redaction of the Mishnah is absolutely fantastic. It's clear that this tripartite statement is echoing another Shimon in the beginning of the chapter, and that is Shimon HaTzadik, right? Simon the Righteous. Simon the Righteous says, the world exists for the sake of three things. He opened in the same way. For the sake of Torah, for the sake of the cult, and for the sake of reciprocity. Torah, avodah meaning the temple worship, the cult, and gmilut chasadim, translated here as reciprocity. And what is the relationship between these two statements, right? It's clear that the later Shimon is responding to the earlier Shimon. Now, actually, Shimon the Righteous was the high priest, right? The Mishnah is not clear about that. And in general, the Mishnah tries to erase the role of the priests during Second Temple period. It's clear that the Mishnah is biased. When it talks about this transmission and the chain of the transmission, the most important participants, the priests, are erased. And it's clear that the Mishnah is polemicizing against the Sadducees or a group of priests. But still, Shimon HaTzadik, Shimon, the high priest, cannot be completely ignored. And what he's saying is actually a good representation of the ideology of Second Temple Judaism, and that is the role of Torah, the role of the temple. The temple was a center of Jewish life during that period, and Gemilut Chasadim, and in general, the ethical parts of the Torah. And that is, again, it's before, it doesn't talk about specific mitzvot. It doesn't go on to the details that were developed by the rabbis only later on. We're talking about the pillars of Judaism, the early pillars with which we can actually see if we read another text that admires Simon the Righteous, Shimon HaTzadik, is a wisdom text of Ben Sira, right, around 200 BCE, and he has a full chapter of describing the importance of this Simon, who was the ruler of the people and ruled in justice and was the head of the temple and established the behavior according to the Torah. So you have all these elements. But what happens to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel? So who is this Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel? This Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, the father of Reb Judah the Patriarch, is active in the middle of the 2nd century under Roman rule. And what I would argue here, that what he's saying, he's taking the statement of Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik, and he's saying, I am adopting a new philosophy of power, a new philosophy of ruling, and that is according to the Roman model. Because it's the Romans, when they ruled, it wasn't a rule by sword only, but it was mainly presenting themselves as bringing peace, Pax Romana, and bringing peace through the presence of the justice system, the Roman justice system. One of the roles of Roman administrators was to provide this. So what you see is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, I think, copying this idea. So you see how the focus, right, of Jewish philosophy is changing from early Second Temple period to this Roman context. Now, an earlier example for dealing with external practices and external models, if we think about the Hellenistic model of justice, so we immediately think about rhetoric and the role of orators, right? Those speaking, those lawyers that we know that speak in courts and try to persuade the judges. The classical Greek texts are full of this kind. This is a hero in the classical Greek world. And here we find, again, within this Hellenistic context, we find the saying of two sages who are active during the end of the Hashmonaic period, Shimon ben Shetach and Yehuda ben Tabai. And here there are two interesting facts. The first is that we know historically that they're exactly at the point where the Pharisees were at their height of their power, and the Alexandra Salome, the wife of Yanai, the Hashmonaic king, she handed the court system to the Pharisees, and they were in charge of that system. So what you find is statements of the same rabbis of the same period giving basic instructions of how to organize a system. And again, here we see it's parallel. In Avot, it's more of practical instructions. And in other tractates, you find legal instructions that the same rabbis are giving how to maintain the court system. One of the statements, it says, I'll say it in Hebrew and then I'll read it in translation, that he says, Yehuda ben Tabai says, Al tas atzmecha ke orchei hadayanim. Now, usually, that's the way it appears in the printed editions, and it's translated, don't make yourself to be like a lawyer, or orech din in Hebrew is a lawyer. So that's the way it's translated, but the truth is that term is a Greek term. If we look at the manuscripts, so we see the term is not orchei dayanim, but is actually archi dayanim, which is a very interesting combination of Greek and Hebrew. Archi, head, and dayanim, judges. Don't make yourself as though you were the head of the judges. Now, this is a term that we don't know from Hebrew literature. We don't know from rabbinic literature. We need to look outside the boundaries of Jewish sources to understand what is it referring to. And here comes a very interesting thing. I won't go into too many details, but this is a case where we know this position of the head of the judges from Egypt. So think that we're talking about a Jew, and the Jews of that period were influenced by what is happening in Egypt, both the Hellenistic culture and also Egyptian elements. The most famous case I could bring is Hillel, that created the Prusbul, which is an Egyptian kind of document. Anyhow, so what you see here is that he's referring to an Egyptian institution of this head of the judges. And what is the role of the head of the judges in the Egyptian system as we know it from a historian called Diodorus Siculus? What Diodorus describes is how does a system work that is committed only to the truth and does everything to disregard any kind of the power of rhetoric. A system that is afraid of rhetoric and it creates is how are we going to be committed to the truth only? And what they have is a whole system that the parties are not allowed to talk at all. They bring written statements and they present it to the judges, and the judge looks at the statement, looks at the responses. Both of the sides just respond in writing. He reads the statements, and then he takes the small image that he has on himself of the God of truth, Mat, the Egyptian God of truth, and he puts the image on the side that he rules for. There's no talking. You don't have to be afraid of someone trying to lie or persuade you in some problematic form. You're not afraid of rhetoric. So what is very interesting here is that it's clear that this description of the Egyptian model is described, and Diodorus is very clear about it, in response to the Hellenistic model. This is the question of the period. How are we going to maintain a just court system? And what are we going to do with rhetoric as a real problem within our system? And so I think it's not coincidental that the same rabbi continues when he says, do not act like orchei dayanim, and when the litigants stand before you in a case, assume they are guilty, but when they are dismissed from the court, treat them as innocent, right? So you have to be very, very suspicious of the people. And then you have Shimon ben Shetach saying, be careful with your words, that the witnesses will not know how to lie. I would say this is the big question of the time, of the period, right? How to make a justice system without falling into the problematics of rhetoric. And the rabbis are creating a solution, and they're responding to the Egyptian solution. Suddenly we find this discourse with multiple views just from understanding that the rabbi was mentioning a Greek term.
Interesting. Firstly, it's fascinating that on such a small rabbinic aphorism, like, I don't know, a dozen words or so, one can see the tensions between that and the Hellenistic and the Egyptian.
That's such an important point.
And also, of course, it's just fascinating from a linguistic perspective, the idea that it's not orchei dayanim, but it's archei dayanim, like an arch dayan, like a head dayan, as it were.
Right.
That has wormed its way into Pirkei Avot. That's fascinating. I want to continue a little bit in this vein of talking about philosophical parallels, as it were, because at the end of the day, as you've pointed out, these rabbis are thinking and acting and teaching within a kind of Greco-Roman philosophical world. And my question is, to what extent can one see this in Pirkei Avot? Are there traces of influence that we can see that the rabbis are specifically copying or responding to or responding against? In other words, how much or to what extent can we say that the teachings of Pirkei Avot are dealing with issues? What are those issues? What are some examples of contemporary philosophical or ethical issues that they are fighting against?
So I think we must acknowledge the challenge that this question poses. Before I just answer, it's important for me to say that there's a basic methodological issue here that all scholars of rabbinic literature are dealing with. And each of us chooses a different path. But it's important to understand the big question. And the big question is, how can we identify cultural and philosophical exchange when the rabbis are so minimalistic in their forms of expression? They speak a different language than languages around them. They do not quote anyone outside their own school. So they give you an image of a completely isolated group. And someone who would argue that you should read their rabbis as an isolated, ultra-Orthodox group, let's imagine them in that form, would presumably be justified in that description. Now I need, as a scholar, to puncture this image through, I found this Greek word, archei dayanim, and I'm taking it very, very seriously as an indication to a much larger debate. So someone could someone can dismiss, say, this is not even the right wording of the Mishnah. And someone could say, okay, I'll take the word, but you're loading too much meaning into this word, and it's not part of a larger debate. They had the word that they used it and whatever, and just read what the Gemara says about this. And there are a few Gemara that actually you see, what I would argue, that the Chachamim simply don't understand the term and change it into things that they do understand because they're out of context. And regarding philosophy, should we assume that the rabbis are involved in a dialogue with Greco-Roman philosophy? Now, the problem is, if we're going to quote one scholar in this, there are multiple scholars that I should have quoted along the way, but if we were going to quote one important scholar in our discussion, it's obviously the late Saul Lieberman, in a famous article called "How Much Greek in Roman Palestine." And he's a more careful philologist, and he says, do we have any indications of rabbinic knowledge of foreign institutions? So he said, look, if we're talking about legal institutions, they clearly know about it. I mean, after all, they were also sent to Roman courts. So that's why we have a lot of description of, let's say, Roman practices, especially in the legal context. But do we have an indication that they knew a Greek philosophy? How do I check that? There's no Greek terminology. And what Lieberman emphasizes, there are no names of philosophers. They don't know who Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, they don't know all these names. They never mention them. They do mention Homer, because Homer was like the basic textbook of children. There's a Gemara that says there are two philosophers that the Gentiles had. One is Bilam, okay, we understand that. And the second one is Avnimus Agardi, this name that no one had heard of, this Avnimus, who was active in Gadara. Gadara is a city in Jordan. So if they say that those are the most important philosophers, they don't know beyond. So we have to think of these people that are completely provincial. So Lieberman leaves it in such a way. And on the other hand, making comparisons, very general comparisons between the rabbis and Greek philosophy is problematic, right? Because it becomes too general. So do we have a way to really find more precise parallels? And I think, and that's what, I think Pirkei Avot is a place to search for it. Right? Because we have a lot of statements and we have to listen to them very, very closely. And my argument would be that the rabbis didn't learn Greek philosophy. They didn't know enough Greek to do that. But at least on a popular level, and exactly because Pirkei Avot is aphorism and sayings and statements that were spread more widely to a larger audience. They knew the kind of messages that Greek philosophers had. And we should say that if this is a period where the issue of self-improvement, of creating like a popular mode, let's say, of studying and transforming philosophy from a technical issue to a more popular mode of living, that was something that was all around the rabbis. And we know that from Greco-Roman sources. So it makes sense that we would find responses. And what I would argue that there are some texts in Pirkei Avot that are best interpreted when viewed as a response to such Roman. So if we have some time, I can bring an example or two.
Yeah. Can you give one or two examples? I'm fascinated as to
sure.
More obvious examples of this.
So we mentioned Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai and his school. So in general, we should just point out how innovative what he's asking them. What is the good way that one should choose, or the straight, actually, that's even in a Greek terminology, it's more important. What is a straight way that one should choose? What is not the way one should choose? And what he has here is, I would say, he maps out human characteristics, and he maps out the virtues. Each of the students gives one virtue, and then he decides what is the relationship between these virtues. Now, in order to identify some kind of dialogue with current ideas, but this is a complicated thing. There's no easy way just to finding a term or something like that. We have to, on the one hand, view it on, I would say, it diachronic dimension and on a synchronic dimension, meaning viewing how innovative is this kind of discourse, in comparison to what we know from Second Temple literature? And at the same time, can we understand this innovative discourse against its current period? So in a very interesting article of Yehuda Goldin about this house of study, what he called the philosophical school of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, he noted that this kind of discussion is a new discussion because Jews or sources from Second Temple and biblical and Second Temple time would just gather various virtues together and say you should be A, B, such and such and such and such, and that's a good way of living, and the bad way of living is such and such and such. We have these kinds of lists in Second Temple sources, but never do we have like a reflection, an analytical reflection of what is the internal relationship, creating what we would say a drama within the self. What is the relationship between the different elements within my behavior, within my own image? So he compares that to Stoic kind of discourse. This Stoic philosophy, which was the popular philosophy then, mapped out human behavior, right, in a very crude psychological mode. But this kind of mapping out is something that fits into the present mode. Now, this is, again, there's no literary, linguistic, technical comparison. There's only this kind of mode of philosophical analysis. But one of the statements of the disciples of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai relates directly, I think, to current philosophical debates. One of the students says, now again, we have a problem because if we learn it from the printed editions, we miss the whole point. So again, you'll excuse that I have to relate to the manuscripts. This Mishnah says, Rabbi Lezer says, if we read it according to the printed edition, be diligent to study Torah and know how to respond to an epikoros and know before whom you labor. Right? Now, this Mishnah seems to say that its most important thing is to learn Torah, and then you should know how to respond to an epikoros, a person who doesn't believe in God, or more specifically doesn't believe in God's providence over the world and his connection to humans, and know who you're working, who is your labor. Now, that's simply not the correct version. And it shows you that people simply could not understand this Mishnah when they were outside of the philosophical context. So the original wording of the Mishnah is, be diligent to study how to respond to an epikoros. There's no Torah in this Mishnah. It's a Mishnah without Torah. It's a Mishnah with focusing on knowing how to respond to the other school. And who would say such a statement? That's exactly the kind of statement that a Stoic philosopher would say against his rivals in the Epicurean school. What is the difference between the two schools? One school of Epicurus views the God as disconnected from the world, not worried about the world. If the perfect state is a state of quietness, of not being worried, so God cannot be connected to the world, because otherwise, if he is in charge of the world, that means that he toils all day, he worries all the time, and he's a God. The image of God is not the philosophical perfect image. And the Stoics are exactly the opposite. They view the world and God as a kind of partners. Humans and gods are partners in this world. So this is a religious discourse, but it is a religious philosophical discourse that you see that both philosophers and rabbis of the time are developing tools to answer. Now, there's one small difference between the way a Stoic philosopher would answer and the way the rabbi would answer, or the way the rabbi answers in the Mishnah. I think this is where you see the effect or the way the rabbis are aware of the discourse around them, and in a very subtle manner are redirecting it to their own views, or even offering an alternative to the Greek philosophical view. In one sentence, if the Stoic philosopher would say, and we have sources like that, God and humans are partners in taking care of the world, what the rabbi is saying, what Rabbi Elazar is saying, know before whom you labor, right? For your employer can be trusted to pay you exactly what your work is worth. That means that the image of God and human relationship is that of a landowner and his labor, right? We are on some level not slaves, but we are completely committed to the will of God, and we have no autonomy in that sense. And here's a crucial difference between the way Greek philosophers talked in that time, viewing people as completely autonomous, comparing them to gods, and the way Jews would say, I prefer this Stoic position, but we have to redefine the relationship between humans and gods.
Right, so sort of somewhere between the Stoics and the Epicureans, not accepting that God is distant, but also not accepting a true partnership, God as very present, but also the master or the landlord.
Right. I would just add to emphasize that I think, let's take just another short example, because I think the statement in the beginning of the third chapter, very famous statement. Unfortunately, we hear it many times when we go to funerals. Akavia ben Malalel says, contemplate three things and you will not fall into clutches of transgression. No, 1, from where you came, 2, and towards what you are headed, and 3, and before whom you will eventually give an account of yourself. This seems to me, this is a version of a famous Roman statement. We can read it in Seneca, who says what a person has to do when he contemplates himself. He has to look into himself all the time. And what he has to do is the soul should know whither it is going and whence it came, right? Where you come from and where you're going to. You want to know thyself. That is the project of the philosopher, to know thyself, look into yourself, understand who you are. And you see that by knowing where you came from and where you're going to. Now, the rabbi is taking this and saying, look, it's important to know where you're coming from and where you're going to, but he adds a third part to this statement, which changes completely the whole attitude of the person. When he contemplates his self, it's not in order to develop this kind of agency and this kind of individual meaning to himself and to his own role and to his uniqueness and etc. No, ultimately, it's in order he has to see who he is going to be judged in front of. So it's using Greek aphorisms, using this kind of language, but diverting it ultimately to a God-abiding kind of subject who is ultimately committed to God's will. So I think it's very interesting that we see here a knowledge of contemporary language, but using it in order to somehow subvert. And here comes also a political aspect, which is very interesting, that you don't view humans as those who have power. So the Greco-Roman concept of self-control, of looking into yourself, the hero of the Greek philosophers is one who controls himself and knows how to do exactly what he's supposed to do, etc., and not be influenced by external powers. And that fits also their imperial position, right, within that world. Here you have Jews that understand that they're submitted to others. They don't have power, but they transform it rather from the political power to God as the ultimate power. That's the way I understand it. And again, I may be reading it into too much, but once you acknowledge that there is some kind of implicit dialogue between rabbinic statements and philosophical statements, so we can try and think what is exactly the larger context of this dialogue.
Interesting. One area to which I want to take the dialogue a little bit is not just the content, but form, on which you've written as well, which is that some parts of, one intriguing part of the form in which some of these Mishnah take is that of paradox. Perhaps the most famous is the first Mishnah of the fourth chapter, where Ben Zoma says things like, Ezehu Gibor HaKovesh et Yitro, right? Who is strong? Someone who defeats his own desires. And, the same with who is wise, who learns from other people, etc., etc. And these are paradoxes, and as you pointed out, a very specific kind of paradox. Can you perhaps elaborate on what is trying to be achieved by wording the wisdom in this particular way?
Right. It's this is another case where you can read the Mishnah without knowing anything. It's a nice statement. It's the importance of, right, Ben Zoma, who is a sage, whoever learns from everyone, who is a hero, whoever conquers his impulse. And again, it's good for educational intentions, etc. But once you understand the context, you can rethink the implications of choosing this Greco-Roman form of expression. It's called a Stoic paradox. The term paradox here, I should just mention, not in the meaning of something that is self-contradictory as we would use the word paradox, but in Greek, paradox means beyond the way most people would view it or understand it, or the standard usage. Doxa is the opinion of people. So it's beyond the opinion of standard people. And what it says is that we have to create a new language, because the Stoics were very, very strict with their ethical standards. Just to say very briefly, there is a basic dispute within Greek philosophy. What is considered good? Is being healthy a good thing? So students of Aristotle would say, yes, it's good to be healthy. It's good to be rich. There's nothing bad about that. It helps you live better. You can take care of your family in a better manner, etc., etc. But Stoics were very strict about their view of value. What gives something value? And the only thing that gives something value is human determination, is if it's a result of some kind of human decision towards an ethical purpose, meaning that nothing external of your own decisions is relevant to your situation and to your quality, to how good your situation is. Now, that requires refashioning your whole language, right? Because again, being Ezehu Ashir, right? Who is rich something that is valuable. So standard of social views are that money is a good thing. I mean, you have to be careful, etc. But basically, it elevates the quality of your life. But the Stoics demanded to rethink the terms that we use. Therefore, they would say only the sage is rich. Because who is really rich? The one who understands what he really needs. If you understand that you don't really need anything that is external to you in order to be a good person, you don't need anything. It's not a matter of how much money you have and how good your life is and how your family is doing it. Though all those are external things that you don't really control. The only thing that could make you rich in a sense that it's a good thing, is something they have control over. So what you have to do is understand that money has no meaning, and that you are, as the Mishnah says, you are satisfied with your portion. So it could be like the way a teacher will tell his student, Dad, don't take too much care about money and stuff like that. That's on a standard level. But actually, what the Stoics are demanding is something much more extreme. And they're demanding a revision of our old ethical, which puts them outside of social norms. And here comes another Jewish perspective, I would say. Because Philo of Alexandria, very interestingly, this Jewish philosopher of the first century, right, who interpreted the Torah in philosophical manner, and is very famous for the way he combined Greek philosophy and Jewish sources or Jewish thought. And one of his treatises is that every good man is free. Again, he takes a Stoic notion of this paradox that freedom is not a political or social or economical category, but it's an ethical category. So only the wise people who are philosophically understand what is good, what is really good for them, and what's really good, not good for them, could be really free. Because otherwise, you're a slave of the many powers that shake you and push you and pull you around. So only a philosopher can release himself from these powers. Now, the interesting thing is, so he brings a lot of philosophical proofs and quotes and sources, but at the center of this book, and I had the privilege to translate this book into Hebrew some years ago, and it's a fantastic text because he brings a lot of stories that prove the point. But at the center of the book, he mentions a group that we mentioned earlier in our talk, and that those are the Essenes. He said the ultimate embodiment of this perfection of free people are the Jewish Essenes. And he's quite explicit about his critique of Greek philosophy, meaning he says Greeks know how to talk about these things. Those who know how to practice these things, right, are barbarians. He mentions the Indians, gymnosophists, the group of Indian philosophers, and the Essenes who live a life of freedom, and he makes many stories. And it's very interesting. So he's taking this Greek idea, developing it, this is the most extensive treatises on this issue. And then he actually says that the ultimate example for that are non-Greek cases. So that is a classical expression of, I would say, like an indigenous group who says, I absorb the ideology of the governing, the powerful ideologies, etc., and those in power, but I'm going to actually say that this small group, this powerless group, is actually one who embodies it in the most perfect way and better than the ruling class. And that's exactly what I think with the rabbis, when they're using this kind of terminology, they're saying, we know this kind of language, and we're doing it better, and we're connecting it also to our religious ideologies. Let's put it this way. You can read it on multiple levels. You can read it on a simple wisdom saying instruction that any kid can understand, but actually this is an opportunity for the rabbis, and there are many, many other examples like that, to develop a more sophisticated political theology and political ethics.
Right. I suppose the final question I'd like to pose to him, I'm curious to your answer, is do you think there is one coherent philosophy that emerges, one coherent worldview that emerges from Pirkei Avot? Because, as you said, you can read this as a very diverse text with many, many different fragmentary opinions, just like you'd read, any of the other Mishnah, the Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, whatever it is. But Pirkei Avot, you do have all these rabbinic statements. They are all collected into one group. Presumably the editors and the compilers did have something in mind, some sort of, they did want to give over, again, a worldview, even if it is very diverse. I mean, does one way of looking at the world, or one conception of God or the Torah or something, does that emerge from the text? Are there like central message that can be taken from all this diversity?
Thank you for the question. I'm not sure how to answer it. I don't have a clear answer. This is in general not a way that I would try to read rabbis. There's always a delicate relationship between the diverse views and the redactors and the editors overall. We as readers, or as modern readers, are many times looking for a logos, for an overarching meaning of the thing, the text, the unit that we're working on. I think the rabbis are working differently. And again, the examples that I brought show you that they are responding. And again, that's the way I read them. I read them as responding to what's happening around them. That does not create a systematic philosophy. Responding is a way to negotiate what's happening around you. It's a way to make sense, right? And have some kind of position, but it is not this kind of overarching systematic view. So we know there are things that are important for them, right? The study of Torah is the most important issue here in the tractate. The study of Torah is the thing that liberates you. This is actually an idea that appears in the 6th chapter. And when they're saying that, they're saying, hey, what we're doing reflects or is a better model than what the Gentiles have. But I think in general, you've spoken to many philosophers in this podcast, and I wonder if you would pose this question: how much can we talk about a Jewish philosophy in general, or is Jewish philosophy on the whole more of a responsive kind of a mode of thinking and of action? And so what they're providing a framework, they're providing a way of life, a way of working, this kind of very subtle interpretation and development of the traditions that they have. They're creating this environment of what we would call the Bet HaMidrash. I think that's much of what we get here. Again, we can trace specific ideas to major ideas among the Pharisees, and views that the rabbis rejected, theological views that the rabbis rejected, they also reject here. But I cannot be more specific concerning the specific message, I would say, of the tractate of the whole. And that's why I said we always have to be viewed in multiple levels, from the discrete statement to the intermediate units to the complex structure as a whole.
Fantastic. Okay. That's very fair, and you probably couldn't get a better answer than that for a tractate like this. This has been fantastic, Professor Yair Furstenberg. Thank you so much for coming to the podcast of Jewish Ideas and for talking to us about Pirkei Avot. This has been a wonderful ride. I would also like to recommend, before we go, anyone who is proficient enough in Hebrew to listen to Professor Furstenberg's lectures online on YouTube. He has a series with Beit Avichai, also in Hebrew on Pirkei Avot, a series of 7 lectures, very much worthwhile. And I'd recommend everyone whose interest has been piqued by our conversation today to go there and listen further. Thank you so much, Professor, for coming to join us, and we hope to see you again soon.
It was a pleasure. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.